The elevator doors opened on the 23rd floor, and there stood Marcus Chen, adjusting his tie nervously as he stepped into what used to be Richardson and Associates corporate headquarters. The same marble floors that had once intimidated me now gleamed under my ownership. The same mahogany conference table where they'd torn apart my business proposal now hosted my monthly board meetings. Marcus didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? The last time he'd seen me, I was wearing a wrinkled shirt and carrying a backpack full of rejected loan applications. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. "Mr. Thompson will see you now," my assistant announced, and I watched Marcus's face drain of color as the pieces clicked into place. David Thompson. The same David Thompson he'd called delusional and financially illiterate 3 years ago. The same David Thompson whose commercial real estate empire now controlled half the premium office space in downtown Seattle. 3 years earlier, I was nobody. Just another 28-year-old with a business degree from Washington State and a head full of impossible dreams. I'd been working as a junior analyst at Meridian Financial Group, making $38,000 a year, and living in a studio apartment that smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs. Every morning I'd ride the bus past the gleaming office towers downtown, watching successful people in expensive suits disappear into buildings I could never afford to rent space in. The idea came to me during one of those bus rides. Seattle was booming. Tech companies were expanding. Startups were launching daily, and everyone needed office space. But the commercial real estate market was dominated by old money families and established firms who'd been playing the game for decades. They controlled the premium locations, set the prices, and determined who got access to the best spaces. Small businesses and growing companies were forced to settle for whatever scraps were left over, often in subpar locations with inflexible lease terms. I saw an opportunity in the gap. What if someone could acquire undervalued properties, renovate them to modern standards, and offer flexible leasing options specifically designed for growing businesses? Not the corporate giants who could afford Park Avenue rents, but the ambitious entrepreneurs who needed professional space without the crushing overhead. The concept was simple, but execution would require capital I didn't have. I needed investors, loans, and most importantly, credibility in a world where I was completely unknown. My first stop was Meridian Financial, my own employer. I figured they knew me, had seen my work ethic, and might be willing to take a chance on an employee with entrepreneurial ambitions. I spent weeks preparing my presentation, researching comparable properties, analyzing market trends, and creating financial projections that showed exactly how the business would generate returns. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the small conference room on the 14th floor. I arrived 20 minutes early, wearing my best suit, the only suit I owned, and carrying a leather portfolio I'd bought specifically for the occasion. My hands were sweating as I arranged my materials on the table, checking and rechecking that everything was perfect. James Hartford, the senior partner, entered first. He was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from 40 years of successful investments. Behind him came Patricia Wells, the head of commercial lending, and Marcus Chen, who at 35 was considered the rising star of the firm's real estate division. "David," James nodded as he took his seat at the head of the table. "I understand you have a business proposition for us." I launched into my presentation with all the enthusiasm and preparation I could muster. I explained the market opportunity, showed them my research on undervalued properties, and walked them through detailed financial projections. I talked about the growing demand for flexible office space, the inefficiencies in the current market, and how my approach could generate consistent returns while serving an underserved segment of businesses. For 45 minutes, I gave everything I had. I answered their questions, addressed their concerns, and painted a picture of the future I was determined to build. When I finished, the room fell silent. James leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Patricia shuffled through my documents without making eye contact. But it was Marcus who spoke first, and his words hit me like a physical blow. "David, I appreciate the effort you've put into this, but I have to be honest. This is one of the most naive business proposals I've ever seen." The words hung in the air as Marcus continued. "You're talking about competing with established players who have decades of experience and hundreds of millions in capital. You want to acquire prime real estate in one of the most expensive markets in the country, with no track record, no connections, and frankly, no understanding of how this industry actually works." Patricia nodded in agreement. "The commercial real estate business isn't something you just decide to get into because you see an opportunity. It requires relationships built over years, deep market knowledge, and access to capital that, frankly, someone at your level simply doesn't have." James was more diplomatic, but no less crushing. "David, you're a talented analyst, and we value your work here at Meridian. But commercial real estate development is a completely different game. The barriers to entry exist for good reasons. They separate serious players from people who've watched too many business documentaries." Marcus wasn't finished. "Let me give you some perspective. The properties you've identified as undervalued? They're priced exactly where they should be based on their current condition and potential. The renovation costs you've estimated? They're about 60% lower than reality. The lease rates you think you can charge? They're based on wishful thinking rather than market analysis." He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what I assumed were recent comparable properties. Last month, Hartwell Commercial tried to do something similar with a building on Spring Street. They had $20 million in backing, a team of experienced developers, and connections throughout the city. They lost $4 million and had to sell at a loss within 18 months. "And that was with professionals who knew what they were doing," Patricia added. "Someone with your background and resources would be financially destroyed within 6 months." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but it was essentially over. They picked apart every aspect of my plan with surgical precision, pointing out flaws I hadn't considered and obstacles I hadn't anticipated. By the time I gathered my materials to leave, I felt like I'd been put through a shredder. "David," James said as I reached the door, "we hope this doesn't discourage you from focusing on your career here at Meridian. You have potential in traditional finance, and that's where your energy should be directed." I walked back to my desk in a daze, past colleagues who had no idea what had just happened. For the rest of the afternoon, I sat staring at my computer screen, unable to concentrate on the routine analysis that suddenly felt meaningless. The numbers on my spreadsheets blurred together as I replayed every brutal moment of the meeting. That evening, I sat in my tiny apartment with a beer and a notebook, writing down everything they'd said. Not because I wanted to relive the humiliation, but because I needed to understand whether they were right. Had I been delusional? Was my plan really as naive as they'd made it sound? I spent the next week doing something I should have done before the meeting, talking to people who actually worked in commercial real estate. I reached out to property managers, construction supervisors, and small business owners who had navigated the leasing process. What I discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Marcus had been right about some things. My renovation cost estimates were indeed too low, and some of the properties I'd identified had hidden issues that justified their current pricing. But he'd been wrong about other things, and more importantly, his dismissive attitude had blinded him to the genuine market opportunity I'd identified. Small business owners were indeed frustrated with the current options. They needed flexible lease terms, reasonable rates, and spaces designed for modern work rather than traditional corporate hierarchies. The established players were so focused on large corporate clients that they'd completely ignored this growing segment of the market. The question wasn't whether the opportunity existed, it was whether someone like me could execute on it. Over the following weeks, I refined my approach. I researched every successful commercial real estate entrepreneur I could find, studying their backgrounds and early strategies. Many had started with far less than I had imagined. Some had begun by subleasing space they couldn't fully utilize. Others had partnered with property owners who were struggling with vacant buildings. I discovered that success in commercial real estate wasn't just about having millions in capital. It was about understanding value, building relationships, and finding creative solutions to other people's problems. The barriers Marcus had described were real, but they weren't insurmountable for someone willing to start small and think differently. My next approach would be completely different. Instead of trying to convince established investors to fund my grand vision, I would prove the concept on a smaller scale. I would find my first property, secure it with creative financing, and demonstrate that my approach could work in the real world. But first, I had to survive the daily reminder of my failure. Every day at Meridian, I walked past the conference room where they'd dissected my dreams. Every interaction with Marcus, Patricia, and James carried the weight of their judgment. They were polite but distant, treating me like someone who'd overstepped boundaries and needed to be kept in line. Marcus, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in small reminders of my place. During team meetings, he'd make jokes about unrealistic ambitions and knowing your limitations. When discussing commercial real estate deals that crossed his desk, he'd glance in my direction with a knowing smirk that said, "This is how it's really done." The worst part wasn't their attitude. It was the doubt they'd planted in my mind. Late at night, when I was working on my revised business plan, their voices would echo in my head. Naive. Delusional. Financially illiterate. The words had weight, because they came from people who were undeniably successful in the world I wanted to enter. But doubt, I was learning, could be fuel if you channeled it correctly. Every dismissive comment became motivation to prove them wrong. Every obstacle they'd predicted became a challenge to overcome. Every day I remained trapped in my junior analyst role became another reminder of what I was working to escape. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The transformation had begun, though I didn't recognize it at the time. The rejected proposal wasn't the end of my commercial real estate ambitions. It was the beginning of something much more personal. This wasn't just about building a business anymore. It was about proving that conventional wisdom could be wrong, that barriers could be broken, and that sometimes the people who know the least about why something can't be done are the ones who find a way to do it. I continued working at Meridian, but everything had changed. I was no longer David Thompson, the eager analyst hoping for approval from his superiors. I was David Thompson, the future commercial real estate mogul, temporarily disguised as someone who worked for people who would someday need something from me. The real work was just beginning. 6 months after my humiliation at Meridian, I was living a double life. By day, I analyzed investment portfolios and pretended to care about quarterly reports. By night, I haunted coffee shops throughout Seattle, mapping every vacant building, researching property owners, and studying lease agreements with the intensity of someone preparing for war. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, the 73-year-old owner of Rosita's Diner, the Mexican restaurant below my apartment. I'd been grabbing dinner there 3 times a week for over a year, and she'd started treating me like the son she never had, always asking about my work and whether I was eating enough vegetables. One evening in late November, I found her sitting alone at the counter after closing time, staring at a stack of papers with obvious frustration. The restaurant was empty except for the lingering smell of carnitas and the soft hum of the refrigeration units. "Tough day, Mrs. Vasquez?" I asked, sliding onto the stool next to her. Ugly bending, she looked up with tired eyes and sighed. "David, you understand business, right? Numbers and contracts and all that complicated stuff?" I nodded, and she pushed the papers toward me. "My landlord wants to sell the building. Says I can either buy it for $400,000 or find a new place by March. After 32 years here, he's giving me 4 months to figure out my life." I examined the documents, a purchase offer, financing options, and a termination notice for her lease. The building was a narrow 3-story structure built in the 1960s, with Rosita's Diner occupying the ground floor and 2 small apartments above. The location was decent, situated on Pine Street just 8 blocks from the emerging tech corridor, but the building needed significant updates. "Mrs. Vasquez, have you considered what you'd do with the upstairs if you bought the building?" She shrugged. "Rent them out, I suppose. But I don't know anything about being a landlord. I barely know how to run a restaurant without going crazy." That's when the idea hit me. Not the grand vision I'd presented to Meridian, but something smaller, more manageable, and infinitely more real. What if we became partners? Over the next hour, fueled by coffee and leftover flan, I outlined a proposal that would change both our lives. I would help her secure financing to purchase the building, handle all the landlord responsibilities for the upstairs units, and in exchange, she would give me a stake in the property and the right to manage the commercial space. But the real opportunity wasn't the existing apartments. It was what we could do with them. The upstairs units were cramped and outdated as residential spaces, but they could be converted into modern office suites perfect for freelancers, consultants, and small businesses who needed professional space without corporate overhead. Mrs. Vasquez was skeptical at first. "David, you're a sweet boy, but you're still just a kid with a regular job. How are you going to help me get $400,000? That question launched the most intensive research project of my life. I spent the next 2 weeks learning everything I could about small business loans, property financing, and partnership structures. I discovered that Mrs. Vasquez's 32-year history as a tenant gave her significant advantages. She had perfect payment history, established cash flow, and the kind of community reputation that banks actually valued. More importantly, I learned that the building's current owner, Gerald Hoffman, was a 78-year-old retiree who was selling because he was tired of dealing with maintenance issues and tenant problems. He wasn't looking to maximize profit. He wanted a quick, clean sale to someone who would take care of the property. The financing strategy I developed was unconventional but legal. Mrs. Vasquez would apply for a small business administration loan using her restaurant's cash flow as collateral. I would contribute my savings, $23,000 I'd accumulated over 3 years of living like a monk, as a down payment supplement. In exchange, I would receive a 25% ownership stake and full management rights to the upstairs commercial space. But the key was convincing Gerald Hoffman to carry part of the financing himself. Instead of demanding the full $400,000 up front, he could receive $300,000 at closing and the remaining $100,000 over 5 years at a competitive interest rate. This would give him steady income during retirement while making the purchase feasible for us. The first meeting with Gerald took place at his home in Bellevue, a modest rambler surrounded by rose gardens his late wife had planted 40 years earlier. He was a retired Boeing engineer who'd bought the Pine Street building as an investment property in 1987 and had watched it appreciate steadily but modestly over the decades. "Mrs. Vasquez is a good tenant," he admitted, pouring coffee from a pot that looked older than I was. "Never late with rent, never causes problems. But the building needs work, and I'm too old to deal with contractors and permits." I presented our proposal with the confidence I'd developed through months of preparation. We would take care of all maintenance and improvements, ensure reliable income through the restaurant's established business, and develop the upstairs space to increase the property's value. Gerald would receive his money without the hassle of dealing with unknown buyers or potential financing complications. "Young man," Gerald said after reviewing our proposal, "I've been in business long enough to spot people who know what they're talking about and people who are just making noise. You've done your homework." 2 weeks later, we had a handshake agreement. Gerald would sell us the building for $400,000 with owner financing for the final $100,000. Mrs. Vasquez would maintain her restaurant and gain building ownership security. I would transform the upstairs into professional office space and prove that my commercial real estate vision could work in the real world. The legal process took another month, during which I learned more about property law, zoning regulations, and construction permits than I'd ever wanted to know. I spent my lunch hours at the city planning office, my evenings researching contractors, and my weekends measuring rooms and sketching renovation plans. The transformation of the upstairs units began in January. Working with a small crew led by Roberto Silva, a contractor Mrs. Vasquez had known for years, we converted 2 cramped apartments into 4 modern office suites. Each suite was designed for 1 to 3 people, with high-speed internet, shared conference space, and flexible lease terms that traditional commercial landlords wouldn't consider. The renovation budget was tight, $60,000 I'd borrowed against my future ownership stake, but Roberto's team worked magic. They removed walls to create open floor plans, installed modern lighting and electrical systems, and added the kind of amenities that knowledge workers expected: built-in desks, plenty of outlets, and professional quality phone and internet infrastructure. The design philosophy was simple: create space that felt professional without being corporate, comfortable without being residential. We used bright colors, natural light, and flexible furniture to create an environment where people would actually want to work. While the construction was happening upstairs, life continued below. Mrs. Vasquez served her regular customers, who were initially skeptical about the noise and disruption but gradually became curious about what we were building. Several asked about renting space for their own small businesses. The first tenant inquiry came from Sarah Mitchell, a freelance graphic designer who'd been working from her apartment kitchen table for 2 years. She'd seen our office space available sign and stopped in for lunch with Mrs. Vasquez, who had become our unofficial marketing director. "I need somewhere professional to meet with clients," Sarah explained over coffee. "But I can't afford downtown rates, and I don't need a full office all the time." This led to our first innovation in flexible leasing. Instead of requiring a traditional 1-year lease, we offered Sarah a month-to-month arrangement with options for full-time or part-time use. She could have her own dedicated workspace 3 days a week and access to shared conference space when needed. The rate was 60% of what she'd pay for comparable space downtown, with utilities and internet included. Sarah moved in during the 3rd week of February, and her presence transformed the dynamic of the building. Suddenly, we had proof of concept, a real business operating in our renovated space, generating revenue, and demonstrating that our approach could work. The second tenant was Marcus Rodriguez, an independent insurance agent who'd been working from a cluttered home office for 5 years. He needed professional space for client meetings, but couldn't justify the expense of traditional commercial rent. Our flexible arrangement allowed him to rent conference room access by the hour, while maintaining a small dedicated workspace for files and phone calls. By March, we had 4 tenants generating enough revenue to cover our mortgage payments and operating expenses. More importantly, we had a waiting list of potential tenants who'd heard about our flexible approach through word of mouth. The success wasn't lost on the commercial real estate community. Property managers who'd dismissed small businesses as too risky or too much trouble were suddenly asking how we were making it work. Other property owners with underutilized space were inquiring about partnership opportunities. But the most satisfying moment came on a Thursday afternoon in April when I was reviewing lease agreements at the small desk I'd set up in what used to be Mrs. Vasquez's storage room. My phone rang and the caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately. "David Thompson?" The voice was Marcus Chen from Meridian Financial. Speaking. "David, it's Marcus Chen from Meridian. I hope you remember me." I smiled, remembering every word of our last conversation. "Of course, Marcus. What can I do for you?" "Well, this is a bit awkward, but I've been hearing some interesting things about a property management venture you're involved with on Pine Street. One of our clients is looking for flexible office space for their growing consulting firm, and your name came up as someone who might have solutions." The irony was delicious. Marcus Chen, who had called my business plan naive and financially illiterate, was now calling to ask for my services. "I'd be happy to discuss options with your client," I said, keeping my tone professional. "We specialize in flexible arrangements for growing businesses that need professional space without traditional commercial constraints." "That sounds exactly like what they're looking for. Would it be possible to schedule a tour of your facility?" I scheduled the appointment for the following Tuesday, giving myself time to prepare for what would essentially be my first presentation to someone from my former life at Meridian. The client was Thompson & Associates, a management consulting firm that had outgrown their home offices but wasn't ready for a full corporate suite. The tour went perfectly. Thompson & Associates signed a 6-month lease for 2 office suites with shared conference access. But more importantly, Marcus Chen spent the entire visit asking questions about our business model, renovation process, and tenant acquisition strategy. "David, I have to ask, is this the same concept you presented to us last year?" "The core idea is similar," I replied, "but the execution is completely different. Instead of trying to acquire multiple properties simultaneously, I started with one building and proved the concept could work. Instead of competing with established players for premium locations, I found an undervalued property and created value through renovation and flexible leasing." Marcus nodded slowly. "And instead of needing millions in capital, you found a way to start with partnership and creative financing." "Exactly." He paused, looking around the bustling office suites that had once been neglected apartments. "David, I owe you an apology." When you presented your idea to us, I focused on all the reasons it couldn't work instead of looking for ways it might work. I was wrong. The apology felt good, but it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that the foundation was now solid. We had proven that the market existed, that our approach could generate revenue, and that we could scale the concept to additional properties. Mrs. Vasquez and I celebrated that evening with dinner at her restaurant, reviewing the financial reports that showed consistent profitability and a growing waiting list of potential tenants. We'd transformed a struggling property into a thriving business hub while preserving the neighborhood character that made it special. But this was just the beginning. The success of Pine Street had given us credibility, cash flow, and most importantly, a proven system that could be replicated. Other property owners were already approaching us about partnership opportunities, and I was starting to envision a network of flexible office spaces throughout Seattle. The boy who'd been dismissed as delusional was becoming a legitimate player in commercial real estate, one creative deal at a time. The success of Pine Street created a problem I hadn't anticipated: too much demand and not enough space. By September, we had a waiting list of 37 businesses looking for flexible office arrangements, and I was turning away potential tenants weekly. The phone calls were becoming increasingly desperate. Startups needing space immediately, established businesses wanting to downsize from expensive corporate leases, and entrepreneurs who'd heard about our model through networking events. That's when I met Victoria Brennan at a Seattle Chamber of Commerce mixer. She was a real estate attorney in her mid-40s who specialized in commercial property transactions, and she'd been watching our Pine Street operation with professional curiosity. "David Thompson," she approached me near the networking event's coffee station. "I'm Victoria Brennan. I've been following your work on Pine Street, and I think we should talk." Victoria had the kind of confidence that comes from 20 years of closing complex deals. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her handshake conveyed both strength and assessment. She was sizing me up within seconds of meeting me. "I represent several property owners who are struggling with partially vacant buildings," she continued. "Traditional leasing isn't working for them, and they're losing money on spaces that could be productive. Your Pine Street model might be exactly what they need." Over coffee the following week, Victoria outlined opportunities that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. She represented the estate of William Hartley, who had owned 4 buildings throughout Seattle's Capitol Hill and Fremont neighborhoods. The buildings were architecturally interesting but functionally outdated, too small for major corporate tenants, too expensive for traditional small businesses. "The estate wants to sell," Victoria explained, "but they're realistic about market conditions. These aren't prime downtown properties, and they need significant updates to attract premium tenants. However, for someone with your approach, they could be gold mines." The Hartley portfolio represented a massive opportunity and an equally massive risk. The 4 buildings would cost $2.1 million total, require at least $400,000 in renovations, and need creative financing that went far beyond what Mrs. Vasquez and I had managed with Pine Street. But Victoria had a proposal that made the impossible seem achievable. Instead of traditional purchase financing, she'd structured a deal where I would assume management of the properties with an option to purchase over 5 years. The estate would retain ownership while I handled all renovations, leasing, and operations. Profits would be split 60-40 in my favor, and I'd have the right to buy each building at predetermined prices based on performance metrics. "It's essentially a 5-year audition," Victoria summarized. "You prove you can transform these properties into profitable ventures, and you earn the right to own them. The estate gets professional management and income without the headaches of dealing with renovations and difficult tenants." The first property was a 3-story brick building in Capitol Hill that had been built as a boarding house in 1924. The ground floor had been retail space for decades, currently occupied by a struggling bookstore paying below-market rent. The upper floors contained 8 small units that had been used as artist studios, but were now mostly vacant due to outdated electrical systems and inadequate heating. I spent 2 weeks analyzing the building's potential. The location was excellent, 3 blocks from the light rail station and surrounded by cafes, restaurants, and creative businesses. The bone structure was solid, with high ceilings, large windows, and the kind of character that modern construction couldn't replicate. But the infrastructure needed complete overhaul. Roberto Silva, who had become my go-to contractor after Pine Street's success, walked through the building with me on a rainy October morning. His assessment was simultaneously encouraging and daunting. "The foundation is rock solid," he said, examining the basement. "The electrical system is from 1987, which means it needs replacement but isn't dangerous. The plumbing is actually newer than I expected. The biggest challenge is going to be HVAC. This building was never designed for modern heating and cooling. We developed a renovation plan that would transform the upper floors into 12 modern office suites, ranging from 200 to 400 square feet each. The key innovation was creating shared amenities that would make small spaces feel larger. A common kitchen, conference rooms, printing facilities, and collaborative work areas. The ground floor presented a different challenge. The bookstore, Emerald City Books, had been there for 15 years, but was barely surviving the transition to digital reading. The owner, Janet Kim, was a literature professor who'd opened the store as a passion project, but was now considering closing due to declining sales and rising overhead. Rather than evicting Janet, I proposed a partnership that would benefit both our businesses. We would renovate the retail space to include a coffee bar and event space, creating a community hub that would drive traffic for both the bookstore and the upstairs offices. Janet would pay reduced rent in exchange for managing the coffee service and hosting evening events that would showcase the building's creative atmosphere. The renovation took 4 months and cost $180,000, financed through a combination of my Pine Street profits and a small business loan secured by the management contract. We worked systematically through each floor, updating electrical and plumbing while preserving the building's historic character. The transformation was remarkable. We exposed original brick walls, restored hardwood floors, and installed modern amenities within the existing architectural framework. Each office suite had large windows, built-in storage, and flexible layouts that could accommodate different types of work. But the real magic happened when tenants started moving in. The first was Alex Chen, a software developer who'd been working from home but needed professional space for client meetings. The second was Maria Santos, a freelance marketing consultant who wanted to escape the isolation of working alone. The third was Jennifer Walsh, an architectural photographer who needed both office space and a small studio for portfolio work. Within 6 weeks, the building was fully occupied with a diverse mix of creative professionals, consultants, and small business owners. The coffee bar became a natural networking hub, where tenants collaborated on projects, shared referrals, and built professional relationships. Evening events drew audiences from throughout the neighborhood, creating additional revenue and community connections. The financial results exceeded our projections. Monthly rental income from the 12 office suites totaled $8,400, while the ground floor renovation had increased Janet's business enough to justify paying $2,200 per month instead of her previous $1,400. Operating expenses were manageable due to shared utilities and maintenance costs, leaving healthy profit margins that impressed even Victoria's experienced eye. Word spread quickly through Seattle's entrepreneurial community. Business journals wrote articles about our innovative approach to urban workspace, and I started receiving invitations to speak at real estate conferences. More importantly, other property owners began approaching me about management opportunities. The second Hartley building, located in Fremont, presented different challenges and opportunities. It was a former warehouse that had been converted to live work units in the 1990s. But the conversion had been done poorly, creating spaces that were neither comfortable for living nor practical for working. Instead of trying to fix the flawed residential conversion, we reconceptualized the entire building as a collaborative workspace for creative businesses that needed more than traditional office space. We created studios for graphic designers, workshop space for craftspeople, and production areas for small manufacturers who were being priced out of other neighborhoods. The renovation strategy focused on maximizing flexibility while maintaining industrial character. We preserved the open floor plans and high ceilings while adding modern electrical, plumbing, and internet infrastructure. Each tenant space could be reconfigured as needs changed, and shared facilities included loading docks, storage areas, and meeting spaces. This building attracted a different type of tenant: furniture makers, jewelry designers, specialty food producers, and other businesses that needed space to create physical products. The monthly rent structure was different too, with base rates supplemented by usage fees for shared equipment and utilities. By the end of my first year managing the Hartley properties, I was operating 3 buildings with 62 tenant spaces generating over $35,000 in monthly revenue. But the real achievement wasn't financial. It was the communities we'd created within each building. The Capitol Hill building had developed into a creative professional hub where collaborations happened naturally. Tenants regularly worked together on projects, shared resources, and supported each other's businesses. The Fremont warehouse had become a makerspace where traditional craftspeople worked alongside modern designers, creating products that reflected both heritage techniques and contemporary aesthetics. Even Pine Street had evolved beyond its original concept. Mrs. Vasquez's restaurant had become an unofficial meeting place for tenants from all 3 buildings, and she'd started catering lunch meetings for businesses throughout our network. The success attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Seattle's Economic Development Office invited me to consult on adaptive reuse projects in underutilized neighborhoods. The Small Business Administration featured our model in a case study about innovative urban development. And most surprisingly, I started receiving calls from commercial real estate companies wanting to hire me as a consultant. But the call that mattered most came on a Thursday afternoon in December. I was reviewing lease agreements at the Capitol Hill building when my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in over a year. "David, this is James Hartford from Meridian Financial. I hope you have a few minutes to talk." James Hartford, the senior partner who had presided over my humiliation 18 months earlier. The man who had suggested I focus on traditional finance instead of pursuing commercial real estate ambitions. "Of course, James. What can I do for you?" "David, I'm calling because Meridian is interested in discussing a potential partnership with your property management operation. We have clients who are looking for exactly the kind of flexible workspace solutions you've developed." The conversation that followed was surreal. James explained that several of Meridian's clients were downsizing from expensive corporate leases, but still needed professional space for their operations. Traditional commercial real estate wasn't meeting their needs, and they'd heard about our success through business networks. "We'd like to explore having you manage properties for some of our clients," James continued. "We're also interested in potentially investing in your expansion plans." I let the irony wash over me before responding. "James, I appreciate the call. I'd be happy to discuss how we might work together. When would it be convenient for you to tour our existing properties?" We scheduled a meeting for the following week, and I spent the weekend preparing for what would essentially be a reversal of our previous encounter. This time they would be coming to me, seeking my expertise and asking for my services. The tour began at Pine Street, where Mrs. Vasquez greeted James and his team with the warmth she showed all our business visitors. The building was bustling with activity, tenants working, meetings happening, and the kind of productive energy that couldn't be faked. "This is impressive," James admitted as we walked through the renovated office suites. "The utilization rate is remarkable, and the tenant satisfaction is obvious." At Capitol Hill, he was even more impressed by the community we'd built. Tenants interrupted their work to show off their spaces and explain how the building's collaborative atmosphere had helped their businesses grow. The coffee bar was full of people working, meeting, and networking in ways that traditional office buildings never facilitated. "David," James said as we concluded the tour, "I owe you an apology. When you presented your concept to us, I focused on the obstacles instead of the opportunities. You've proven that there was a real market need that we failed to recognize." The apology felt good, but what felt better was the partnership proposal that followed. Meridian wanted to invest $500,000 in our expansion, help us acquire additional properties, and provide banking services to our growing network of tenant businesses. But I wasn't the same person who had desperately sought their approval 18 months earlier. Now I had leverage, options, and most importantly, the confidence that comes from proven success. "James, I'm interested in exploring a partnership, but it would need to be structured as a collaboration between equals, rather than an investment in a junior partner." The negotiations that followed would reshape both our businesses and set the stage for the empire I was building. But first, I had a decision to make about how big I wanted this to become, and how fast I was willing to grow. The boy who had been called delusional was now being courted by the same people who had dismissed his dreams. The question was whether I was ready to show them just how wrong they had been. The partnership negotiations with Meridian Financial stretched over 3 months, during which I learned more about corporate politics and power dynamics than 4 years of business school could have taught me. James Hartford, Patricia Wells, and Marcus Chen had approached me expecting a grateful recipient of their investment offer. Instead, they encountered someone who had transformed failure into leverage. Our first formal meeting took place in Meridian's main conference room, the same space where they had dismantled my original proposal. But this time, I entered as an equal partner candidate, not a desperate employee seeking approval. I wore a custom-tailored suit, purchased with profits from my property management business, carried a leather briefcase containing detailed financial reports, and most importantly, possessed the confidence that comes from proven success. "David," James began, "we've reviewed your operation extensively, and we're impressed by what you've accomplished. Meridian would like to offer a $500,000 investment in exchange for a 40% equity stake in your property management company." I had anticipated this opening offer and prepared accordingly. "James, I appreciate Meridian's interest, but I think there's been a misunderstanding about what I'm looking for. I'm not seeking equity investors. I'm considering strategic partnerships that could benefit both organizations." The subtle shift in language was intentional. By rejecting their equity offer, I was establishing that my business was successful enough to choose its partners rather than desperately seeking capital. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly not accustomed to having investment offers declined. "What kind of partnership are you envisioning?" Marcus asked, his tone more cautious than it had been during our previous encounter. I opened my briefcase and distributed copies of a proposal I'd spent weeks developing with Victoria Brennan's legal expertise. "Meridian has clients who need flexible workspace solutions. I have a proven system for creating and managing those solutions. Instead of an equity investment, I'm proposing a strategic alliance where Meridian refers clients to my properties in exchange for preferred rates and revenue sharing on successful placements." The proposal outlined a relationship where both organizations maintained independence while benefiting from each other's strengths. Meridian would gain access to workspace solutions for their clients without the overhead of managing properties themselves. I would gain access to Meridian's extensive client network while retaining full control of my operations. Additionally, I continued, I'm willing to discuss Meridian providing banking services for my property acquisitions in exchange for exclusive financing relationships and preferred lending rates. James studied the proposal with the careful attention of someone who recognized its sophistication. This wasn't the work of an inexperienced analyst. It was a comprehensive business strategy developed by someone who understood market dynamics and negotiation leverage. "David, this is significantly different from a traditional investment relationship. We'd essentially be treating you as an established business partner rather than a funding recipient." "That's correct," I replied, "because that's what I am." The room fell silent as the implications settled. 2 years earlier, I had been their employee, seeking their approval for an untested concept. Now I was proposing a partnership between equals, backed by proven performance and multiple revenue streams. "Mole." Marcus broke the silence. "Can you walk us through your current financial position and growth projections?" For the next hour, I presented detailed analysis of my property portfolio, tenant retention rates, revenue growth, and expansion plans. The numbers told a story of consistent profitability, strong market demand, and sustainable business practices. More importantly, they demonstrated that I no longer needed Meridian's money. I was offering them access to opportunities they couldn't create themselves. "Our current portfolio generates $68,000 in monthly revenue across 4 properties," I explained. "Tenant retention is 94%, and we have waiting lists at all locations. We're profitable, debt levels are manageable, and cash flow supports expansion without external equity investment." Patricia, who had been quietly reviewing the financial statements, looked up with obvious surprise. "David, these numbers suggest you're generating over $800,000 annually. That's significant revenue for a business that's less than 2 years old." "The market demand has exceeded our initial projections," I confirmed, "which is why I'm interested in strategic partnerships that can help accelerate growth while maintaining operational control." The conversation continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from property acquisition strategies to tenant screening processes. But the real negotiation was about respect and recognition. They were slowly accepting that the naive analyst they had dismissed was now running a successful business that they wanted to be associated with. The breakthrough came when James asked about my long-term vision. "David, where do you see this business in 5 years?" I had prepared for this question, but my answer reflected ambitions that would have seemed impossible during our first meeting. "I see a network of 20 to 30 properties throughout the Pacific Northwest, providing flexible workspace solutions for over 1,000 businesses. We'll be the preferred alternative to traditional commercial real estate for growing companies that need professional space without corporate overhead. And you believe the market can support that level of expansion? The market is already demanding that level of expansion. We're turning away potential tenants weekly because we don't have enough space. The question isn't whether demand exists. It's whether we can scale our operations fast enough to meet demand while maintaining quality standards." Marcus leaned forward, his expression showing genuine interest rather than skepticism. "What would you need from a strategic partner to achieve that growth rate?" "Access to deal flow, banking relationships that understand our business model, and referral networks that connect us with businesses seeking workspace solutions. Meridian has all three, which is why this partnership makes sense for both organizations." The meeting concluded with an agreement to draft formal partnership terms over the following month. But the real victory was psychological. I had entered as an equal and been treated as one throughout the discussion. Walking back to my Capitol Hill building that afternoon, I reflected on how completely the dynamics had changed. 2 years earlier, I had left this same conference room feeling humiliated and defeated. Now I was leaving as someone whose partnership was actively sought by the same people who had dismissed my potential. The formal partnership agreement took 6 weeks to negotiate, during which both organizations conducted extensive due diligence on each other. Victoria Brennan represented my interests, ensuring that the partnership preserved my operational independence while providing access to Meridian's resources. The final agreement established Meridian as the preferred banking partner for my property acquisitions, with streamlined loan processes and competitive rates. In exchange, I would provide workspace solutions for Meridian's clients at preferred rates, with revenue sharing on successful long-term placements. But the most significant clause was one that Victoria had insisted upon: a right of first refusal on any properties that Meridian's clients wanted to sell or lease. This gave me access to deal flow that would have taken years to develop independently. The partnership launched with immediate results. Within the first month, Meridian referred 3 clients who signed leases totaling $4,200 in monthly revenue. More importantly, they introduced me to Catherine Liu, the owner of a struggling office building in Ballard who was considering selling due to low occupancy rates. Catherine's building was a 1970s structure that had been designed for traditional corporate tenants, but was now largely vacant due to changing workplace preferences. The location was excellent, walking distance from restaurants and public transportation, but the space was configured in ways that didn't match modern business needs. "I've had this building for 8 years, Catherine explained during our first meeting. Occupancy peaked at 80% in 2019, but it's dropped to 30% over the past 2 years. Traditional tenants want newer buildings with better amenities, and small businesses can't afford the lease terms that make the building profitable." The building presented both challenges and opportunities that perfectly matched my expertise. It needed significant reconfiguration to create the flexible spaces that modern businesses demanded, but the infrastructure was solid, and the location was ideal for the creative professionals and growing companies that formed my target market. I proposed a management arrangement similar to the Hartley portfolio, with the option to purchase based on performance metrics. Catherine would retain ownership while I handled all renovations, leasing, and operations. Profits would be split based on performance, and I would have the right to purchase the building at a predetermined price if I met specific occupancy and revenue targets. The renovation took 8 months and required the most extensive construction project I had undertaken. We reconfigured 3 floors of traditional office space into 42 flexible suites, ranging from individual workspaces to collaborative areas for small teams. The ground floor became a shared facility with conference rooms, event space, and a coffee bar similar to our Capitol Hill location. But the Ballard Building allowed me to implement innovations that weren't possible in my earlier properties. We installed state-of-the-art internet infrastructure to support technology companies, created soundproof spaces for phone calls and video conferences, and designed flexible layouts that could be recombined as tenant needs changed. The tenant mix reflected Seattle's evolving economy: software developers, digital marketing agencies, consultants, and creative professionals who needed professional space but valued flexibility over traditional corporate amenities. Lease terms ranged from month-to-month arrangements for freelancers to 2-year commitments for established small businesses. Within 6 months of completing the renovation, the building was 96% occupied with a waiting list of potential tenants. Monthly revenue exceeded $28,000, representing a dramatic improvement from the $8,400 Catherine had been generating before our partnership. The success of the Ballard Building established my reputation throughout Seattle's commercial real estate community. Property owners who had been skeptical of my unconventional approach were now actively seeking partnerships. Real estate brokers who had ignored my previous inquiries were calling with potential deals, but the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. The Seattle Business Journal featured my property management company in a cover story titled, "Reimagining Commercial Real Estate: How One Entrepreneur is Transforming Underutilized Buildings." The article detailed my journey from rejected Meridian analyst to successful property manager, highlighting the innovative approaches that had generated consistent profits while serving underserved market segments. It included quotes from tenants who credited our flexible arrangements with enabling their business growth and property owners who had seen dramatic improvements in their building performance. More importantly, the article included a sidebar interview with James Hartford, Patricia Wells, and Marcus Chen, discussing how their initial assessment of my business proposal had been wrong. David presented a concept that challenged our assumptions about commercial real estate. James was quoted as saying, "We focused on traditional barriers rather than market opportunities, and we missed the potential of his innovative approach." It's been gratifying to work with him as a strategic partner and see how wrong our initial assessment was. Marcus's quote was even more direct. David's success demonstrates that sometimes the most conventional wisdom is the most limiting factor in recognizing genuine innovation. His business model has proven that there was significant unmet demand in the commercial real estate market. Reading those quotes felt like vindication, but it was also something more. It was confirmation that I had fundamentally changed how the commercial real estate community viewed both market opportunities and my capabilities as a business developer. The partnership with Meridian had evolved into something neither side had originally envisioned. Instead of a traditional investment relationship, we had created a strategic alliance that benefited both organizations while maintaining our respective independence. Meridian gained access to innovative workspace solutions for their clients, while I gained access to deal flow and banking relationships that accelerated my growth. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I viewed my own potential. The analyst who had once desperately sought approval from established players was now setting industry standards and being courted by competitors who wanted to understand how my unconventional approach had generated such consistent success. The foundation was now solid enough to support much larger ambitions. I was no longer proving that my concept could work. I was demonstrating how much larger it could become. The next phase would test whether I could scale from local success to regional dominance, while maintaining the quality and innovation that had driven my initial growth. The people who had once dismissed my potential were now partners in my expansion, but the real test would be whether I could build something significant enough to make their early skepticism seem not just wrong but absurdly limited in scope. The irony reached its peak on a Tuesday morning in October when Marcus Chen walked into my Belltown headquarters, the building I'd purchased and renovated as my company's flagship property. He wasn't there for a partnership meeting or strategic discussion. He was there as a potential tenant, desperately seeking office space for his new consulting firm. The previous 6 months had transformed the commercial real estate landscape in ways that even I hadn't anticipated. My network had grown to include 12 properties throughout Seattle and Tacoma, housing over 400 businesses and generating $180,000 in monthly revenue. But more importantly, we had become the go-to solution for companies that needed professional space without traditional corporate constraints. The Belltown building represented the culmination of everything I'd learned about transforming underutilized properties into thriving business communities. It was a 1960s office tower that had been struggling with 40% vacancy rates when I acquired it through a partnership with the building's pension fund owners. Instead of trying to attract large corporate tenants who demanded expensive build-outs and long-term commitments, we redesigned the entire building around flexibility and community. Each floor contained a mix of private offices, shared workspaces, conference facilities, and collaborative areas. The ground floor featured a business center with professional services, a cafe that served as an informal networking hub, and event space for industry meetings and educational programs. The tenant mix was deliberately diverse: technology startups working alongside established consulting firms, creative agencies collaborating with financial advisors, and independent professionals who needed access to resources that were typically available only in large corporate environments. But the building's most innovative feature was its business incubation program. We reserved 2 floors for early-stage companies, offering below-market rates in exchange for equity stakes and mentorship opportunities. This created a pipeline of growing businesses that often expanded into larger spaces within our network as they developed. The program had generated remarkable results. 7 companies had graduated from our incubation floors to full commercial leases within 18 months. 3 had been acquired by larger companies, generating significant returns on our modest equity investments. 2 had grown large enough to lease entire floors in our other properties. More importantly, the incubation program had established our buildings as centers of entrepreneurial activity, attracting the kind of innovative businesses that traditional commercial landlords struggled to identify and serve. This was the environment that Marcus Chen entered that October morning, though he seemed oblivious to the irony of his situation. He had left Meridian Financial 6 months earlier to launch his own management consulting firm, specializing in strategic planning for mid-market companies. His timing had been unfortunate. The commercial real estate market had tightened significantly, and traditional office space had become both scarce and expensive. "I'm looking for office space for my new consulting practice," Marcus explained to Jennifer Walsh, who had transitioned from tenant to my director of business development. "I need something professional enough for client meetings but flexible enough to accommodate growth." Jennifer, who remembered Marcus from our early Capitol Hill building days, maintained perfect professionalism while scheduling him for a tour with me personally. She didn't mention our history, but her expression suggested she understood the poetic justice of the situation. I prepared for the meeting with careful consideration of how to handle the dynamics. Marcus was genuinely seeking office space, and my business reputation depended on treating all potential tenants professionally, regardless of personal history. But I also recognized the opportunity to demonstrate how completely the power relationship had shifted. Marcus arrived precisely on time, wearing the same type of expensive suit that had once intimidated me during my Meridian days. But his demeanor was different. Less confident, more focused on making a good impression. He was now the one seeking approval rather than granting it. "David," he said, extending his hand with a smile that seemed slightly forced. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me personally. I know you must be incredibly busy." "Not at all, Marcus. I always enjoy showing potential tenants what we've built here." I led him through the building systematically, explaining our philosophy of creating business communities rather than simply leasing office space. We visited the shared conference facilities, the business center with its professional services, and several tenant spaces where businesses were actively collaborating on projects. "This is impressive," Marcus admitted as we toured the technology floor, where a software development company was working alongside a digital marketing agency on a joint client project. "I've never seen commercial space designed to facilitate this kind of collaboration." Traditional office buildings are designed around the assumption that businesses want to be isolated from each other, I explained. We found that most growing companies actually benefit from proximity to complementary businesses and access to shared resources. We continued the tour, visiting the incubation floors, where early-stage companies were developing products and services in spaces specifically designed for startup operations. Marcus asked detailed questions about lease terms, amenities, and the support services we provided to tenants. "How do you make the economics work?" he asked as we reviewed available spaces that might suit his needs. "The amenities and services you're providing seem extensive for the rental rates you're charging." "Volume and efficiency," I replied. "By serving multiple tenants with shared facilities, we can provide amenities that would be prohibitively expensive for individual businesses, while maintaining profitable operations. Plus, our tenant retention rates are significantly higher than industry averages, which reduces our marketing and turnover costs. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Traditional commercial leases often include services that small businesses don't need while excluding services they do need. The conversation was professional and substantive, but I could sense Marcus's growing awareness of the irony. The business model he had once dismissed as naive was now providing solutions he desperately needed for his own venture. We concluded the tour in my executive office on the building's top floor, which offered panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. The office was professionally decorated but not ostentatious. It projected success without seeming excessive. Marcus, we have several options that might work for your consulting practice, I said, reviewing the available spaces. The question is, what kind of arrangement would best support your business development? I outlined 3 possibilities: a traditional private office with access to shared conference facilities, a flexible arrangement that would allow him to scale space usage as his client base grew, or participation in our professional services collaborative, where independent consultants shared resources and referrals. The collaborative option is interesting, Marcus said. How does that work in practice? We have 12 management consultants, financial advisors, and business coaches who maintain individual practices but share marketing costs, administrative support, and client referrals. It's been particularly effective for professionals who are building their practices but don't want the overhead of full office operations. Marcus considered the options carefully. His questions were intelligent and demonstrated genuine interest in understanding how our model could benefit his business. But underlying the professional discussion was the unspoken recognition that he was now seeking services from someone whose business proposal he had once ridiculed. David, I have to ask, is this the same concept you presented to us at Meridian 2.5 years ago? The core philosophy is the same, I replied, but the execution has evolved significantly based on market feedback and operational experience. We've learned what works, what doesn't, and how to scale successfully while maintaining quality. Marcus paused, looking out the window at the Seattle skyline. I owe you an apology, David. When you presented your idea to us, I focused on the risks rather than the opportunities. I was wrong about the market demand, wrong about your capabilities, and wrong about the potential for this kind of business model. The apology was genuine, but it also represented something larger: acknowledgement that conventional wisdom had been incorrect, and that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. I appreciate that, Marcus. But what matters now is whether we can provide workspace solutions that help your consulting practice succeed. We spent another hour discussing his specific needs, reviewing lease terms, and exploring how his practice might benefit from integration with our business community. By the end of the meeting, Marcus had decided to join our professional services collaborative, starting with a small office and shared resources with the option to expand as his practice grew. The paperwork was completed the following week, and Marcus moved into his new office space within our Belltown building. The symbolism was perfect. The man who had once called my business plan financially illiterate was now paying me rent and benefiting from the exact services he had dismissed as impossible. But Marcus wasn't the only Meridian alumnus who had joined our tenant community. Patricia Wells had referred 2 clients who needed temporary office space during office relocations. James Hartford had recommended our services to his nephew, who was launching a financial planning practice. Even employees who had witnessed my original rejection were now utilizing our conference facilities for client meetings. The transformation extended beyond individual relationships. Meridian Financial had become one of our largest corporate clients, referring dozens of businesses to our properties while utilizing our facilities for their own meetings and events. The partnership that had begun as strategic cooperation had evolved into genuine interdependence. The commercial real estate community had taken notice of these developments. Industry publications featured articles about our innovative approach to tenant relations and community building. Real estate conferences invited me to speak about adaptive reuse and flexible leasing strategies. Business schools included our model in their entrepreneurship curricula. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition came from the Seattle Commercial Real Estate Association, which honored our company with its Innovation Award for transforming underutilized properties into thriving business communities while serving previously underserved market segments. The award ceremony was held at the Grand Hyatt, attended by the city's commercial real estate elite. As I accepted the award, I looked out at an audience that included many of the same people who had once dismissed my potential as an industry participant. 3 years ago, I said during my acceptance speech, I was told that commercial real estate was a game for established players with decades of experience and millions in capital. I was told that barriers to entry existed for good reasons, and that innovation in this industry was neither possible nor welcome. I paused, letting the words settle over an audience that included several people who had personally delivered those messages. What I've learned is that barriers often exist not to preserve quality or standards, but to preserve market inefficiencies that benefit established players at the expense of customers who need better solutions. The speech continued for 10 minutes, outlining the principles that had guided our success, focusing on underserved markets, creating value through innovation rather than capital deployment, and building businesses that solved real problems rather than simply generating profit. But the real message was delivered through results, rather than words. Our company now managed properties worth over $15 million, employed 43 people, and housed over 400 businesses. We had transformed from a rejected business proposal into a market leader that was setting industry standards for flexible commercial space. The celebration continued at the reception, where former skeptics approached to congratulate our success and inquire about potential collaborations. But the most meaningful moment came when Marcus Chen approached me near the end of the evening. David, I wanted to thank you for the professionalism you've shown throughout our business relationship. You had every right to be vindictive or petty given our history, but you've consistently focused on providing excellent service regardless of personal considerations. Marcus, success is the best response to criticism. Building something valuable is more satisfying than proving someone wrong. He nodded thoughtfully. I've learned a lot from watching how you've handled growth and success. Your company has exceeded every projection we discussed, and you've done it while maintaining the integrity and innovation that made the concept compelling in the first place. As the evening concluded, I reflected on the complete reversal that had taken place. The people who had once held my career fate in their hands were now tenants, clients, and partners in an enterprise they had initially deemed impossible. But more importantly, I had learned that the greatest revenge against those who doubt your potential isn't proving them wrong. It's building something so successful that their early opposition becomes irrelevant to your ongoing success. The boy who had been called delusional was now leasing office space to the people who had dismissed his dreams. The circle was complete, but the story was far from over. 5 years after Marcus Chen had called my business plan naive, I stood in the executive conference room of Thompson Properties' new headquarters, a building I owned outright, located directly across the street from Meridian Financial's offices. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a perfect perspective of the company that had once dismissed my potential, now dwarfed by the empire I had built. The meeting that morning would finalize the largest acquisition in my company's history. Richardson & Associates, the prestigious commercial real estate firm that had dominated Seattle's market for 3 decades, was selling their entire portfolio to Thompson Properties for $47 million. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The delusional analyst was acquiring the established players who had once seemed untouchable. Richardson & Associates had thrived during the era of traditional corporate leasing, when companies signed 10-year agreements for large office spaces and accepted rigid terms because they had few alternatives. But the business landscape had shifted dramatically toward flexibility, remote work, and collaborative environments. Their model had become obsolete while mine had become essential. William Richardson III, the firm's third-generation owner, sat across from me reviewing the final purchase documents. At 68, he represented old-money Seattle real estate, conservative, traditional, and increasingly out of touch with modern business needs. Mr. Thompson, he said, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant acceptance, I have to admit that when I first heard about your unconventional approach, I assumed it was a temporary trend that would collapse during the first economic downturn. I was wrong. The acquisition included 17 properties throughout the Pacific Northwest, from premium downtown buildings to neighborhood office complexes. But more importantly, it included Richardson's client relationships, property management contracts, and market position. Thompson Properties would become the largest independent commercial real estate company in the region. Mr. Richardson, your firm built an impressive portfolio over 3 decades. We intend to honor that legacy while adapting these properties to serve modern business needs. The integration would take 18 months, during which we would renovate traditional office spaces into flexible work environments, introduce collaborative amenities, and implement the tenant community programs that had become our signature. Some buildings would require minimal changes, while others would need complete reimagining. But the Richardson acquisition represented more than business expansion. It symbolized the complete transformation of Seattle's commercial real estate landscape. The companies that had once dismissed innovative approaches were either adapting to new realities or being acquired by those who had pioneered them. After the signing ceremony, I walked through downtown Seattle, past buildings that now bore Thompson Properties signs, filled with businesses that had found success through our flexible leasing model. The transformation was visible everywhere. Former corporate headquarters converted to collaborative workspaces, struggling retail spaces reimagined as mixed-use communities, and underutilized properties brought back to life through creative partnerships. Mrs. Vasquez's restaurant had become the unofficial headquarters of our tenant network, hosting regular networking events and serving as a meeting place for businesses throughout our portfolio. She had become a minor celebrity in the local business community, featured in articles about entrepreneurship and community building. "David," she said that evening as I stopped by for my usual dinner, "do you remember when you used to sit here with all those papers, worrying about whether anyone would rent our little offices upstairs?" I smiled, looking around the bustling restaurant filled with entrepreneurs, consultants, and business owners who had built their practices within our properties. I remember being terrified that we'd made a terrible mistake and would lose everything. And now look, she gestured toward the framed newspaper articles covering our walls, features about our company's growth, industry innovations, and community impact. You didn't just build a business, Mijo. You built something that helps other people build their businesses. The recognition felt good, but what felt better was the knowledge that we had created something sustainable and meaningful. Our properties housed over 1,200 businesses, employing more than 4,000 people. We had facilitated countless collaborations, partnerships, and innovations that wouldn't have occurred in traditional office environments. The impact extended beyond commercial success. Our adaptive reuse projects had revitalized struggling neighborhoods, preserved architecturally significant buildings, and provided affordable workspace for creative professionals and small businesses that might otherwise have been priced out of the market. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching former skeptics become advocates for our approach. Marcus Chen had built a thriving consulting practice within our professional services collaborative and regularly referred other businesses to our properties. James Hartford had invested personally in 2 of our expansion projects and served on our advisory board. Even Patricia Wells had left traditional banking to launch a financial services firm specializing in innovative real estate ventures. The transformation wasn't limited to individual relationships. Our success had inspired competitors to adopt similar approaches, creating a more diverse and responsive commercial real estate market throughout the region. Traditional leasing companies had begun offering flexible terms, shared amenities, and community programming, innovations that had once seemed impossible within established business models. My own role had evolved as well. I spent less time managing individual properties and more time developing strategic partnerships, identifying new market opportunities, and mentoring other entrepreneurs who were challenging conventional business practices. Thompson Properties had become a platform for innovation, rather than simply a property management company. The most recent venture was Thompson Capital, an investment fund focused on supporting businesses that were reimagining traditional industries. We provided not just funding but also workspace, mentorship, and access to our network of successful entrepreneurs. Several portfolio companies had already achieved significant success, validating our thesis that innovation often comes from outsiders who question established assumptions. But success had also brought responsibilities and challenges that I hadn't anticipated. Managing a company with over 100 employees required different skills than converting vacant buildings. Balancing growth with quality demanded constant attention to systems and culture. Maintaining the entrepreneurial spirit that had driven our initial success while building sustainable corporate infrastructure required careful navigation. The biggest challenge was avoiding the complacency that had undermined many of our former competitors. Success could become a barrier to continued innovation if we became too comfortable with existing approaches or too invested in protecting current market position. That's why I made a decision that surprised many industry observers. Instead of continuing aggressive expansion, Thompson Properties would focus on deepening our impact within existing markets, while sharing our knowledge with entrepreneurs in other cities who wanted to replicate our model. We launched the Thompson Institute, a consulting and education program that taught our property transformation methodology to real estate professionals nationwide. We also created an apprenticeship program that brought emerging entrepreneurs to Seattle for intensive training in adaptive reuse, community building, and innovative leasing strategies. The goal wasn't to franchise our business, but to spread our approach to markets that needed flexible workspace solutions, but lacked local pioneers willing to challenge established practices. Within 2 years, Thompson Institute graduates had launched similar ventures in Portland, Denver, Austin, and Nashville, adapting our principles to their local market conditions. The ripple effects extended far beyond commercial real estate. Our emphasis on community building and collaborative workspace had influenced urban planning discussions, zoning policy debates, and economic development strategies throughout the Pacific Northwest. City officials regularly consulted with us on adaptive reuse projects and mixed-use development initiatives. But the most meaningful recognition came from the thousands of business owners who had built successful enterprises within our properties. Their success stories, the startup that became a major software company, the consultant who grew into a multi-million-dollar advisory firm, the creative agency that expanded internationally, represented the true measure of our impact. Standing in my office that evening, looking out at the Seattle skyline dotted with buildings bearing our company's name, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The rejection at Meridian Financial had felt devastating at the time, but it had forced me to develop resilience, creativity, and determination that traditional success might never have required. The people who had dismissed my potential had inadvertently done me a favor. The rejection had prevented me from following a conventional path that would have been safer, but ultimately less fulfilling. Their skepticism had forced me to prove my concepts in the real world, rather than relying on theoretical projections. Most importantly, their doubt had taught me that the greatest opportunities often exist in the gaps between what established players think is possible and what innovative approaches can actually achieve. The empire was complete, but the story continued. Every day brought new challenges, opportunities, and possibilities for innovation. The difference was that now I faced them with the confidence that comes from having transformed skepticism into success, barriers into advantages, and doubt into determination. The people who had once said my business would fail were now paying me rent. But more than that, they had become partners in building something larger than any of us could have imagined when we first sat around that conference table 5 years ago. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving someone wrong. It's building something so successful that their early opposition becomes irrelevant to your ongoing story. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.